Great. So the date is November 13th, 2018. I'm Heather Gagnon, and I'm here with Chris Carlton. Did I say that right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And we're interviewing William H. Ward III, MD. So, Dr. Ward, would you like to tell us a little bit about your work history?
Okay. I came to Gainesville in 1978 to do my medical residency. I graduated from University of Pennsylvania in May of '78, and I got here right before the 1st of July in 1978 for the family practice residency program at the University of Florida. I finished that and in June of 1981. I initially graduated from Coe College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with a degree in business administration in 1966. I got a bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, at Temple University in 1974. I went there from '72 to '74 to take the science courses, and I decided to get a major in psychology because I felt that would be good, if I was going to be an MD. So I finished there in '74 and entered the University of Pennsylvania Medical School in September of '74. My first position after I finished my residency was an independent contractor from June '81 to June '82, and then I ran into a private practice here in Gainesville, and I started on June 2nd, 1982, and I retired at June 30th, 2015. In May 28th, 1968, I entered the U.S. Army Security Agency as an intelligence analyst. I had been trying to get out of the draft for 2 years. I had a medical appeal that I wanted to do, and I was turned down initially. I did another one. They eventually turned that down, and I finally got my draft notice, the final one, which I couldn't avoid, in 5 days after Martin Luther King was assassinated. I entered, as I said, the Army May 28th, 1968, and 10 days after I was inducted on the 28th of May, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And I couldn't really, these big shocks were happening. First it was JFK, and when I was a sophomore in college. Malcolm X was a year and some months, a year later, it was 65, I think he was assassinated. So it was a couple years later, Malcolm X, then Martin King, and then Robert. And those were like earth-shaking events of the 1960s. They were the most important events of that time period. The protest against Vietnam, the war on Vietnam, began sometime after Malcolm was assassinated, and he was assassinated in '65, and 66, 67, 68 was when it really fired up. I didn't see any of that. I was in my training school up in Fort Devens, Massachusetts, which lasted a little less than a year. I got to Fort Devens right around Labor Day. I had a month's leave after I finished basic, which ended right around the 1st of September. And you have to wait for your security clearance when you enter the Army Security Agency before you can go to your school, because we have a top secret code word security clearance. It's the highest you can get. And so I finally started my school in probably November or early December. It was before Christmas. I finished that in the end of February, beginning of March. And then I got put into another MOS. I was lucky that happened, and it happened because I had a friend that I grew up with who had dropped out of college. He was a year or two behind me in high school, but he dropped out of college after a year, and he also went in the Army Security Agency. He had been in Germany, got back to the U.S. Around the time I was going up to Fort Devens, and I gave him a call, and I told him what my MOS was going to be, military occupational specialty. It was an analyst. And so, okay, and I told him what it was going to be, and so what he did was put me in an MOS that came after the other one that normally you don't have to do. The analysts, when they finish their school, they go to wherever their duty station is going to be. So my particular MOS, a lot of them were going to Vietnam, probably well over 50%, but there were plenty of other places to go, and other people went to places like Asmara, Ethiopia, which monitored the Soviet missile launches. I went to, then of course Vietnam was the main one, but you could go to Germany, you could go to Iran, there was a station there. There were various stations in Germany, not only the Army, but Air Force and the Naval Group. So there were listening stations all over the place. But at any rate, he put me in this MOS. It was radio teletype analysis course. And the only places you could go were Germany and Japan. So I ended up going to northern Japan on Hokkaido, which is the northern island. The Air Force also has a field station up there in Wakkanai, which is in the northern tip. Chitose, where I was more towards the south. It was about 20 kilometers from Sapporo, where they had the '72 Olympics. Get some water here. So I was there for a little less than 18 months. That field station closed up. There was an Air Force station in Misawa, which was just across the straits to Honshu, in the northern tip of Honshu. And so the people who had a lot of time left were sent there. People who had less, the people who had been in Chitose for a while had their choice of places to go. I went to Thailand. I was there for a couple of months, and then I ended up getting transferred to Korea, and I was there I got there around Thanksgiving, and I got out December 13th in 71. So at any rate, after that, I didn't know what I was going to do for a while. It took me a while to figure it out, but my family had tradition was MDs for the older son. My father went to Penn, my grandfather went to Penn. They both went to undergrad there as well. But I applied to Penn and some other schools. I was on a waiting list at Minnesota and San Francisco, but I got accepted to Penn, so of course I was going to go there. I was home. So that was my original career. So I got out in December of '71, and I didn't have a lot of contacts of old friends. I didn't know where people were, but one family contact I had was some kids I had grown up with that were nearby. Their father was a general surgeon at Temple University, Their name was Meinhardt. They had 6 kids, and my brother and sister and I all went to school with them. So I have 1 brother and 1 sister. So I want to go to a different document here, and my eyes are blanked out because of all that light. Okay. So the main point of this oral history I'm doing is my personal connections to both of the RFK and JFK assassinations. And I have several personal connections, and I'll just read them first. First is William T. Coleman, Jr. The Colemans were from Philadelphia. Their family and my family had been close friends for 3 generations. I went to school with Mr. Coleman's kids. He was on the Warren Commission. He was the only African American on the commission, and he was a staff lawyer. His closest friend in law school at Yale was Elliot Richardson, who was the only person to come out of Watergate with a clean conscience. He was the one who resigned and brought on the Saturday Night Massacre. And I have this distinct memory of him. It's a mental picture of Mr. Coleman bringing him over to our house and him sitting in the living room in this particular easy chair. I was probably 11 years old, maybe, and I still have this mental picture that I can see of Mr. Coleman sitting in that chair, or Mr. Elliot Richardson sitting in the chair. And so, you know, that's really something that I have this mental picture of something that, you know, took place over about half hour, 45 minutes or something like that, because they had other things to do. But it stuck in my mind. I went to Mr. Coleman's father's boys club camp. My brother and I did, and not only was he the first or the only African American on the commission, but he was sent to interview Fidel Castro because he had met him in the past in the early 50s in Harlem. He was up there with, I think, his new wife, or it may have been honeymoon, but somehow he ran into Castro, probably the Cotton Club or someplace like that. They got to be friends, so he knew Castro. So they sent him to Cuba to interview Castro because Castro was one of the first culprits named. I mean, it's Russia and Cuba. You know, it's always they always get the blame for everything immediately. They're the first ones to get it. So the Navy, the way it was set up, the Navy took him down on a ship, and he was transferred over to this yacht. I don't know whether it was in Havana Harbor or whether it was offshore, but he was taken on board. He interviewed Castro for 3 hours, grilled him with all kinds of questions, and that was that. But Castro explained to him that, you know, he liked JFK, and as a matter of fact, it was either right before or when the assassination happened. The French magazine was over there interviewing him, Le Monde. You know, you've heard of Le Monde, I'm sure. You have, okay. So it's a French, I don't know if it's a weekly or daily or what, but he was being interviewed by them, and he was talking about how he liked JFK. So Fidel convinced him, you know, it wasn't me, I really liked him. So that was the end of the interview, and that was the end of him being one of the chief suspects. The ranking autopsy technician for the John F. Kennedy autopsy was a friend of mine. He lived in Gainesville. His name was Paul O'Connor, and he provided me with firsthand information about what went on in the autopsy that night. My wife went to high school with a woman named Judith Very Baker, and you have her oral history here. She was from Bradenton. She was a prodigy in microbiology when she was from the time she was probably in junior high school. And she was a year behind my wife, at Bradenton Manatee High School. My wife was on the paper. There were usually articles about Judith in the paper. There were articles in various newspapers in Florida, including the Bradenton Herald and others, Miami Herald. And she came to the attention of people all over the country. And she was sent to some special courses and gatherings of high school students who were in the same field. And so she eventually entered UF right after the new year in 1963. She finished the semester, and then she was chosen to go to New Orleans to help a doctor there with a project she was working on. And that eventually ended up being in a book called Dr. Mary's Monkey. The author was Ed Haslam, who also you interviewed him?
No, that was the book I was referring to. I'm sorry, that's the one that we were talking about earlier. Haslam's book. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. So my wife, of course, had, been in contact with Judith through this incredible alumni program they have for Manatee High School. I mean, they have something virtually every year, and it's usually a couple of things. They have luncheons. We went to a reunion last spring, and they graduated in '60, so this was like their 58th. I mean, you don't normally have high school reunions in the 58th year. You have it in the, the 10th, 20th, 30th, 40th, 50th, but not in the 58th. So that's how tight everybody is at Bradenton High School. So Sally had met her through Facebook, and then it turns out she was going to be speaking at a library down in Newport Richey, and Ed Haslam was going to be with her, and they were going to speak about the whole thing. And so I told them I'd video it, and I did. That's up on the web on my YouTube channel. But it turned out that the person who was supposed to manage her, because the doctor there was doing a project for the CIA, and her handler turned out to be none other than Lee Harvey Oswald. And they eventually developed a love affair. They were both not happy in their marriages, and they were going to get divorced and get married themselves, but that was cut short. Mary Sherman was the person she was working for. She was an orthopedic surgeon and pathologist on the staff of Tulane Medical School. Ed Haslam's father was a close friend of hers. She was working to develop a cancer virus that was going to be used to assassinate Castro. There's a clinic there called the Oxner Clinic. The man who started it, I forget his first name, but it's a really famous clinic in New Orleans. And they take care of all kinds of people from everywhere, but about a third of the people they were taking care of were the wealthy from Latin America, Central America and South America. And so Sally and Judith both started at UF around the same time. Sally started in '62, Judith in January of '63. They both went to Manatee Junior College after they finished high school, and part of the time they were there at the same time. But Governor Smathers of Florida is the one who recommended her, and the University of Florida Department of Microbiology. Okay, number 4, my fourth personal connection. The night of RFK's assassination, the doctors who were treating him called a famous neurosurgeon from Temple University for a consultation while RFK was still alive. They were trying to decide whether or not to operate on him to get the bullet out, which you never do. Skull films from the RFK autopsy showed numerous bullet fragments in the anterior portion of the right temporal lobe and the right frontal lobe, which could not possibly have been removed anyway. There were too tiny, there were too many of them. You never take out bullets anywhere unless it's like right there and you can see it or practically see it. It's usually left in. There's all kinds of veterans walking around with shrapnel in their body, and it doesn't bother them. So there was no real reason to do this. But at any rate, they called him. He told them not to operate for fairly obvious reasons. But at any rate, he also told them to treat them the normal way, which was corticosteroids, which is used to reduce swelling and inflammation. At Temple, at that current time, they were also working with hypothermia for traumatic injuries, and potentially he could have also told them that, but that I don't know for certain. But at any rate, they operated, which, you know, when you call the top neurosurgeon in the country for a phone consult and ask him what to do, and he tells you what to do, and then you do the opposite, it's not a good idea. This person had invented a instrument used in neurosurgery. It's called a halo, and basically it's a metal ring with struts on it. Mm-hmm. After they shave the head, it's screwed into the skull, and the surgeons rest their hand on it while they're doing their surgery on the brain. He was on vacation at the time. He was up in Canada with another Temple University surgeon, Dr. Meinhardt, whose kids I grew up with. They were at a hunting and fishing resort, so I heard about this after I got out of the Army from Richard, who was his youngest. Richard eventually became a general surgeon like his father. At the time, he was probably in college. I'm not certain, but at any rate, that's my next connection. The next thing I want to mention is my cousin. She's my second cousin, Meta Warrick Fuller. Her married name was Waller. She died in the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. She was a civilian working in the accounting finance section that had all the computers for the Pentagon budget. The day before September 11th, on September 10th, Rumsfeld announced that there was $3 trillion missing or unexplained from the Pentagon budget. Also there was the Office of Naval Intelligence, and they were working on something that may have been connected to what happened on September 11th. But at any rate, in August, we usually go up to the Cape Cod to visit relatives up there. And I asked one of my other cousins the day before we left, which was August 11th, 2001, where Mita was, because I wanted to make some contact with her. I had only seen her once when I was about 11, 12 years old. She was 4 years older than me, and they lived in Framingham, Massachusetts. And so she went to a school there. It was a public school, but she was the only African American in her class. And so when you're an African American in an all-white high school in a place like that, it's really difficult to adjust to, especially when the prom comes up, because you don't have anybody to go with. So at any rate, that was the only time I had met her. And then the last thing, one of my patients, Robert Lowe, here in Gainesville, he was the son of a man named Jack Lowe, who showed films at the White House and did some of the photography there. He told me that the president always made sure that his father had a tray of food when they showed films at night. Sometimes there were, Hollywood type films. Then there were other films that they showed as well. Okay, so that's that document. Now I'm going to go to my CV, my personal connections. And now I'm going to go to my oral history of my personal connections to the assassination. So I already told you about Mr. Coleman. Let me scroll down here. And then my friend, mainly it's this friendship with the chief autopsy technician for the autopsy, Paul O'Connor, lived in Gainesville. He went to Santa Fe Community College. He worked for the police department. He was born in Indiana in 1941, enlisted in the Navy soon after he graduated. And he was attending the medical technology school at Bethesda Medical Center on November 22nd, was on call that day with Jim Jenkins, whose cousin Paul eventually married, and they lived here in Gainesville. He was Paul's partner for autopsy duty. And they worked together whenever there was an autopsy, and they had a certain set of procedures they could do. As I said, Paul was the chief tech. He was like, he did everything by process, and he was very, stickler about it, because he wouldn't have been the chief tech if he wasn't. So Paul, Jim Jenkins, and Gerald Custer, the X-ray technician who did the X-rays, all three, along with one more, Dennis David, who was the chief of the day. He was in the watch office. He was there. He was the chief. He was the ranking enlisted man, so he's called the chief of the day. And also in the office is the officer of the day, who's who's the officer on call or on duty. All four of those, Paul, Jim, Gerald Custer, and Dennis David, all reported the same thing on that day. A casket arrived at the back of the hospital in a black hearse, and this casket was brought into the morgue. In it, it was a shipping casket. It's not the casket that he was put in Dallas. In Dallas, he was put in a ceremonial casket at a funeral home there. But the main issue was that it was supposed to happen at the county coroner's office. Any murder case, the forensic autopsy is always done in the county where the murder took place, and it's done by the county coroner. That is, every state in the country has that law. But the body was taken at gunpoint by Secret Service to the funeral home. From there, it was put on Air Force One and supposedly came back to Washington. Now, when they brought this casket inside, opened it up, it was a shipping casket. It's not the casket he supposedly came up there in. He was in a body bag, which, that body bags are used for deaths in wars. They come back all the time, and a lot of them came back during the war in Vietnam, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, and Afghanistan, and every other war we've been in since then. They all said the same thing. There was a huge hole in the back of his head. The calvarium was empty except for a handful of brain tissue. The X-ray technician, Gerald Custer, saw Mrs. Kennedy and Robert arrive with the ceremonial casket when it got there sometime between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. So the casket he was supposed to be in, got there between 7:30 and 8. The casket that he was in got there 25 of 7. So Custer was taking the X-rays back to the X-ray department to be developed, because this was the old days, and you had to. It's like any picture. You take a picture, you got to develop the film. So he was on the way back to do that. It took almost an hour to get all that stuff done, whatever pictures were done and whatever X-rays were done. So, and he witnessed them coming in. So did Dennis David. What this means is the fact that he arrived in a different casket is that the chain of custody of the body was lost. Now that's the most incredible thing in the world, because You never lose custody of the body in the murder case because it goes to the county coroner's office, they do the autopsy and issue a report. But there was no paperwork that indicated that this transfer happened, why it happened, when it happened, where it happened. So there's no way to prove that the body was in the same condition it was when it left Dallas. And so it can't be used in any trial. It's out. The only things that can be used are the drawings from Parkland Hospital, what the doctors there and the nurses there, they saw when they took care of the president when he arrived. The drawings of the head wound from the doctors and nurses in Parkland showed a fist-sized hole in the right occipital posterior parietal area, and that's what the wound was. They also described an entrance wound right about here. The person who was doing the press conference in Parkland Hospital after the president had died is on film pointing to it. He said he died of a gunshot wound to the brain, and he's pointing where it went in. There are all the doctors in the hospital, the nurses, they all said the same thing. He had this fist-sized hole in the rear of his head. But when they took him out of the shipping casket in the body bag, he had a huge hole, and I saw one of Paul's pictures of it. And it's mostly the left side of the head. But there were cracks in the skull that you can see in the autopsy pictures. And it was a jagged kind of a hole. Gerald Custer, who was the x-ray tech, said he was able to stick both his hands inside this hole. Paul, who normally does the skull cap and removes the brain, said we didn't have to do that. There was no brain, and if there was a brain, we could have pulled it out through this hole. So my kind of comment to Paul when I saw this picture was that it looks like they took a hammer to his head. Now, he's made this same statement a number of times. Right after the autopsy, it was on Friday night, Saturday morning early. They were called in by the CO of the school, of Bethesda, to be given orders and sign statements that they would never talk about this to anyone. And people didn't even tell their wives. They were afraid to say anything about it. But in 1986, there was a mock trial, and I believe it was held in Britain. And there was an attorney from Nevada who was defending Oswald. His name was Jerry Spence. Richard, I think his first name was Richard, but it's Bugliosi, who tried the Manson case in Los Angeles, was the prosecutor. And so Paul made the same statement under oath. There, he did it again under oath when the House Committee on the Assassinations of the 60s interviewed him in the 1970s. So there's 2 times that he said this under oath, but there's 2 articles in Gainesville Sun. One was in February of '81, which I'm not really sure why he was interviewed on that particular day. This was the middle of February in '81. But he was interviewed again in '83 for the 20th anniversary. That's in the Gainesville Sun. I first met him in 1992 at a Vets for Peace meeting, or 93, I'm sorry, at a Vets for Peace meeting, because the chapter coordinator knew him, and he was going to be speaking at Santa Fe Community College on the 30th anniversary. So he came, talked to us, told the same story, arrived in a shipping casket in a body bag, huge hole in the back of his head, there was no brain. And so he said it then, and I've talked to him a number of times over the 90s, early 2000s. You know, I used to run into him all the time up at Millhopper Shopping Center because we both shopped there. and he died in 2006. So that was the last time period that I knew him. So I have links to to both that mock trial and the interview done by David Lifton, who wrote the book Best Evidence, in which he looked at the autopsy himself, wrote a very thick book about it, and there's a 7 minute, something like that, video of him interviewing these 4 people, or 3 people. It was Paul, the funeral home employee who prepared the body to go in the ceremonial casket, Gerald Custer, who was the X-ray tech, and Dennis David, who was the chief of the day. And so he wanted to have all that on film before the book was released. The book was released a few months later in 1981, but this was probably end of 82 or something, or 1980 when he did this interview of those individuals. So, yeah. So I'm going to send you the links to that, the link to Paul's testimony in the mock trial, which again was under oath. Now, the other thing to note is that Walter Reed and Bethesda are right next to each other. And so the speculation about this change in the caskets and arriving in this body bag and shipping casket, the speculation had been that the body was altered at Walter Reed, and then it was brought over to Bethesda. The people who delivered it were in Scrubs. Okay, so they were at some hospital somewhere, probably the one next door, which was Walter Reed. Now, the way it appears this probably happened is, let me read this here. As I said, it should be noted the Bethesda Naval Hospital and Walter Reed are next door to each other on Rockville Pike, a little north of the DC line. Again, the past speculation has said that the body was removed from the opposite side of Air Force One when LBJ took the oath of office. Jackie had been sitting with the body in the back of the plane, and she didn't come up for that. But then LBJ demanded that she come, and so she was basically forced to come to the front of the plane for the swearing in, and she's in the picture. And so the speculation is that that was when it was removed from the casket, put in the shipping casket and body bag, put on Air Force Two, which got to Washington first, and was taken somewhere. Speculation was that the body was altered. However, as I said before, none of that matters. It doesn't matter whether it was changed or not. They lost chain of custody of the body. And so the autopsy that was done in Bethesda cannot be used in a court because it can't be proved that the body that they worked on was in the same condition as it was when it left Dallas. So, as I said, so what happened was the wounds were altered, this was the thought, to confirm new facts that were being fixed around the government conspiracy theory that Oswald was working alone to assassinate the president. No other scenarios were seriously contemplated, except initially blaming, as I said, the usual whipping boys, the Russians and the Castro. Various motives for Oswald to have done this by himself were tossed around. None of them were really made to be plausible. And so nothing really caught on, so they used the basic, usual, the lone nut, mentally unstable, crazy man, leftist fanatic, Castro supporter, which he wasn't, were used. a friend of mine who was also on the honor guard, I've met him at the conferences I've been to on the assassination, both in New Orleans. That one doesn't happen anymore. That one was called the Oswald Conference. His birthday is October 18th, which actually is the day before my wife's birthday. And so I first started going to these conferences after I filmed Judith and Ed Haslam in October of 2015. This was after I had retired. So Hubert Clark wrote a book about his experience being in the honor guard that carried the casket from the plane in Andrews Air Force Base, or the casket that came off the plane in Andrews Air Force Base. It carried the casket, said the Dallas casket had a broken handle on one side, which I don't know, I thought that was kind of strange that they would put the president in a casket with a broken handle. But at any rate, that was what the team carried from the lift truck that took it off the plane, and then they put it on the military ambulance that took it to Bethesda. They boarded a helicopter that stayed with the motorcade most of the way from Andrews until it neared Bethesda, but then they moved ahead so they'd be there before the ambulance. When the ambulance got there, they were getting ready to go over to unload it, and it suddenly took off. They chased it around the hospital grounds 3 times before it finally stopped in front of the hospital so they could take it in. Meanwhile, as I said, the body was already in the autopsy amphitheater, had pictures, x-rays, and the autopsy was getting ready to start. Since that was a teaching hospital, it had seating for students, and the room was full of generals and admirals, one of whom was Curtis LeMay, an Air Force 4-star, who Daniel Ellsberg said he had heard described as a sadist. LeMay wanted a full-on nuclear strike of Russia when the missile crisis broke out in spring of '62, spring of '61 after the '60 election. JFK refused to do that, and with Bobby, they were able to defuse the crisis and come to an agreement with Premier Khrushchev, which got a promise to never invade Cuba and to remove missiles that were in Turkey, which is what the Soviet Union was angry about, because they had missiles really right on Russia's or Soviet Union's border, pointed at Russia, so they wanted some in Cuba, which basically is understandable. LeMay and numerous other members of the upper echelons in the military never got over JFK's refusal to bail out the Bay of Pigs investigation. He had told them beforehand, I'm not going to do that. And as I said, Paul has done this testimony numerous times. The lecture given at Santa Fe, I would have thought was filmed, and you may have a better access to that than I do, but it's something you might want to try and get a hold of. So I would be pretty sure that they filmed it. He showed the pictures and x-rays that he had, and again, one of them showed this huge hole back here. I was giant. Gerald Custer could stick both his hands in it. Let's see. Oh, the other thing about the caskets was there was a third casket that came. That was delivered by helicopter, but it's never really been, that was really thought to be just kind of a decoy. Dennis David saw that when it came in, so he saw all 3 caskets come. So as I said, in 2015, after I retired, I became formally involved in the assassination research community. I presented this autopsy article in 2016 at the Dallas JFK conference. That's on YouTube, and I can send you the link. I'll send you the link to that as well. Here's the link to Paul's testimony to the HSCA. That's typed, but it's not a transcript. This is a link to the aarclibrary.org, and it's got all these interviews of people who that were done in the 70s when the House Select Committee was looking at it. But the first thing Paul says that neither Humes nor Boswell had ever done an autopsy. They were teachers at the school there. This is the most important forensic autopsy in world history, and there were plenty of autopsy pathologists at the school who could have done it, but in addition, let's see, let me move down here. So Paul's job, as I said, was he removed the skull cap, prepared the upper body for the Y incision, in which goes like this, opens up the chest and abdomen, and they remove organs, take samples, weigh them, take pictures of them, and so forth. And Jim Jenkins, who was his partner, worked on the lower body. They always place a name tag on the right big toe with a piece of wire. None of that happened. So as I said, in the posterior skull, there was this huge wound, huge hole, and it appeared that there had been a surgical procedure done before the body got to Bethesda. The face sheet that either Paul or Jim would have filled out, which has basic demographic type information on it, that wasn't done. And he never saw one. But he was able to recite the autopsy number from memory without having seen it for 14 years. Normally the tissue bank and bone bank are called to prepare to receive these samples. They weren't called. Paul was asked to leave the room at the beginning of the autopsy, and he sat outside the door. The honor guard was outside the door, guarding the door anyway to prevent people from coming in. When he returned, they were sewing up the Y incision. He was told by someone that it was not a normal autopsy. Abdominal organs were removed. The doctors looked around, took the organs out, then they put them back. No samples were taken. And the autopsy itself does not show any slides or x-rays. This was highly abnormal. There are x-rays that exist, but none are of the autopsy. There's only drawings that were used for this House Select Committee investigation. Again, the autopsy findings were fixed around the policy, and they had to fill up the skull with plaster of Paris because there were no bones to close it up. So you had this huge hole back here. The calvarium was filled with plaster of Paris. They put in too much initially, and they had to remove a lot of it before the funeral home was able to take care of the body. And the actual x-rays and photographs were taken by a close friend of Dennis David's, William Pritzker, who later became an officer. So apparently there were copies made. I guess Custer did that. And he was a very close friend of Dennis David. William Pritzker eventually became an officer, but he and Dennis remained close friends until Pritzker died. Pritzker dictated a memo to Dennis about what was done, and he hid them away. Many years later, he was found dead in his office next to a ladder that he had been on. Ceiling tiles had been removed, and the death was ruled a suicide. The autopsy was signed by Colonel Fink, who was the assistant in the autopsy. He was a Marine. He assisted Humes and Boswell in the JFK autopsy, and then his name also appears here in the RFK autopsy. So this one pathologist was involved in 3 autopsies, all of which involved the presidential candidate, and the man who hid away the real x-rays and photographs of President Kennedy, which disappeared when he hid them. So this was years later that this guy was assassinated. This would have destroyed the Warren Commission report because these would have showed this huge hole back here and what the condition of the body actually was. Hall's belief from looking at the body when they put it on the table was that the president was hit in the front and exited in the rear of the skull, blowing out this fist-sized hole in the back of his head. The whole experience had a major effect on Paul. He dropped out of the lab school and was sent from Bethesda to Cecil Field over here near Jacksonville, and eventually to Vietnam, where he was wounded. After discharge, he moved to Gainesville, went to Santa Fe, worked for the police department, married Jim Jenkins' cousin, and they lived in Gainesville until he passed away, and she's still here as far as I know. Paul knew enough about what bullets do from his Vietnam experience and never believed the single bullet theory. Regarding the picture showing the small hole in the occipital region, there's one of these pictures that are supposedly of JFK's top of his head. That's tradition. That's where Humes points to this hole. This is where the bullet came in and blew out this huge thing on the side of his head. It wasn't there, of course, because the back of his head was gone. There was a wound in his that was said to be in his upper back. The drawings of the body from the autopsy, I guess that were done by Humes, was not in the right place. It was too far down in the back. It was down about here. But Paul said the wound was here. He described there was a tracheotomy wound. He described it as sloppy. It was sloppy. When I was a student, I took an ENT course. It was a summer rotation, and it was one during the summer. Any student in any medical school can go to another school to take a course if they want to. Every school in the country has that. So I went to Madison, which is my favorite place in the world, so I was at University of Wisconsin. One of the things that I wanted to do for this course was learn how to intubate, and one of the things we learned how to do was a tracheostomy. We did it on dogs. Me and my partner set the record for quickness and how fast it was done when we did that lab workshop. Paul said the larynx didn't appear to be there. Another thing that Paul mentions, in this testimony to the House Select Committee, the autopsy was filled with all these people. There were FBI agents there, the generals and admirals, and Curtis LeMay blamed the president for not invading Cuba and not attacking Russia with ICBMs. Paul said he was sitting in the gallery with a big cigar in his mouth and was saying things about JFK that angered Paul. Paul really admired JFK. This whole thing was upsetting him. And one of the other things that LeMay didn't like was that JFK refused this plan that the Joint Chiefs presented to him one day called Operation Northwoods. And it was designed to get Americans and Canadians riled up enough to attack Russia and China with nuclear weapons. It's basically a scenario just like the crime of September 11th, 2001, in which people would be shot on the street in Miami, an airliner would go down with passengers on board, and then that would set the stage for a nuclear first strike on Russia and China, which actually plans for that go back to 1943. Was when that was first thought of, and Daniel Ellsberg has written a book about that. But it was really seriously contemplated in the early 50s, and this plan to nuke every city in Russia and China. But they presented this Operation Northwoods, which you all should know about. You need to look that up, but don't use Wikipedia for it. So he refused it. He said these people, when he walked out of the room, slammed the door, and Robert saw Robert, said, "These people are crazy." This is the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Paul said there were people in corners whispering to each other. The president's physician, Admiral Berkeley, had prevented certain things from being looked at because the president's family doesn't want that looked at. Paul was asked to leave the autopsy suite, as I said, didn't return to the end. But the reason for that, I think, is knowing Paul and knowing how he admired the president, he was very upset, and he would not have been shy about showing it. And so I think that's why he was asked to leave. Now I'm going to go through the autopsy article. I first came in contact with this article in probably late October, early November of 1993. And this was around the time that Oliver Stone's movie JFK came out. And I was in the doctor's lounge at Olatford General, and I was sitting with the county coroner, William Hamilton. I'd known he'd been on staff when I started in the early 80s, and he retired just a few years ago. At any rate, we were discussing the movie, and I talked to him about how I didn't, believe the government conspiracy theory, and he told me about this article, and so I had the staff secretary get it from me. This is from the University of Florida Medical Library, and I had it. It just sat in one of my drawers for ever since, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it. But when my cousin died on September 11th, I started looking into that afterwards. And over a period of years, moving up until around 2009, 2010, 2011, I learned a whole lot about what happened on September 11th. People I knew in Vets for Peace saw anomalies right away, which were very obvious and based on past history going back to the war in Vietnam. It was not hard for me to understand that war lies were being told, and because they started a new war less than a month later. It was about 4 weeks, almost exactly. Over the next decade or so, did a whole lot of research, as I said, on September 11th. But when you do that, when you look at the crime of September 11th, you always run into stuff about the JFK assassination. Things keep appearing. And not only JFK, but then Robert, Martin Luther King, and John. JFK's son, who had a clear path to the Democrat nomination in 2000, he died strangely, and a story was concocted for that. But based on this autopsy by Dr. Noguchi, which is like a masterpiece, Robert's assassin was standing behind his right shoulder, but Sirhan, who was in front of him and was restrained immediately by two people probably who you never heard of. You might have, well, you probably didn't either because you didn't follow pro football. But Roosevelt Greer, who was an all-pro defensive tackle for the Giants, and Rayford Johnson, who won the decathlon in 1960, were with RFK. They were walking with him. And so as soon as Sirhan started firing, they were on him. And so he was on the floor or pinned against the table. He was still able to fire the gun. It took him a bit to get the gun away from him, but he was not able to shoot. One of the bystanders, Paul Schrade, who was a close friend of Robert, who was kind of right behind him on the left side, was currently is 93. He'll be speaking this year at the Dallas conference, along with me and a number of others. But he has tried to testify at Sirhan's parole hearings because he was wounded. He was just grazed on his skull, had a minor wound. But, when a bullet hits you on the side of the head, it hurts, and he was stunned and knocked to the floor, but he was not seriously injured. And he knew that Sirhan didn't do it. The parole board will not let him testify. He's been there the last 2 or 3. They won't let him testify. Last year at the JFK conference, this is 2017, they had just done a mock trial, or a practice mock trial in Houston, and I think it was Houston Law School. And Dr. Wecht was involved, and judges from New York, a lot of attorneys and so forth. He spoke at the 2017 conference about this mock trial. He gave the most impassioned speech I've ever heard. And he's probably pushing 90 because he was a well-known pathologist and was the Pittsburgh coroner during the 70s when this happened. But you also run into him. Did you all see the movie about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the pro football player's disease? This is probably 2 or 3 years ago.
This is the one about the concussion.
It's called
the Will Smith.
It's
one?
called.
I didn't see it. But
Yes,
I know what
right.
you're talking about.
Yes. It's called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. What it really is many concussions that leave scars. And when you play football, especially pro football, for long enough, probably does not affect college players because they're not playing for long enough to get this. It's the pro players who get this. And so Dr. Wecht was still the chief of he was the Pittsburgh coroner, and this guy that played by Will Smith, who was I think from Nigeria, I don't remember for certain, but he was one of the autopsy pathologists at the Pittsburgh coroner's office who did autopsies. And the NFL went after him like crazy. They went out, they intimidated the guy's wife. They got the FBI on Cyril Wecht about tax returns and various other things. And Dr. Wecht did not back down in his support of this guy. And eventually the NFL had to really back down, and now they have to, acknowledge that this is a problem and do something to help these players. And that's why there's some new rules, and that's why this targeting penalty has come into being, because it involves the head. And so Dr. Wecht is somebody who's not going to back down from anything. And he talked about how the top forensic pathologist in the country, who was in New York, I don't remember his name, had his bag packed and was ready to go to Washington immediately. Wasn't called. Again, Dr. Humes and Boswell didn't do autopsy, let alone forensic ones. And one was head of the school. The other, Dr. Boswell, I think, was the one who was head of the school, and Dr. Humes was head of the teaching program. And so when Dr. Wecht was on the HSCA committee, he was the only doctor on the medical review committee who stood up to the orthodoxy of the lone nut government conspiracy theory. Remember before that, in 1972, that's when this article came out, it was put in there for a specific reason. We'll go through that, because there were obvious problems with Kennedy's autopsy. It's less than 5 pages long compared to Dr. Noguchi's 59-page true forensic autopsy, And that's what we'll go through here. Sirhan could not have fired the shots that killed Robert Kennedy. It was fired from about right here with a .22 caliber revolver. There were 2 other wounds back in here. One nicked the top of his lung on the right side, collapsed his lung. The other lodged up here in the neck. And he just was, Dr. Warrick was just complaining bitterly about how these other doctors on this review committee would not say the obvious, because you had the autopsy right there. I mean, it's quite obvious that Sirhan, who was up here with Rosie Greer and Rayford Johnson on top of him, couldn't have done it. But they would not change. He was the only one who would not go along with the, with the program. And I have some links to the that I'm going to send you that show this. I'm going to send you these documents, so all this can go up on the page when we put this up. But there's a picture. There's one of the pictures. It's not a picture. It's a drawing. It's on the wrong side of the head. It's over in here, but it's like a giant thing right here. And there's the drawing of the wound according to Humes. Blew a lot of this side of the head off. But the only one that can be used is this one down here in the right lower corner, which shows, you can see it, but it shows this fist-sized hole that the doctors in Parkland and the nurses in Parkland saw. That's the only one that's really true. Here's a picture. There will be a picture here of one of the Dallas doctors demonstrating this wound. He's got his hand like this. There's 2 other doctors with the same picture. And then the next comes David Lifton's research video. He was a graduate of Cornell with a degree in engineering physics. He wrote this book, Best Evidence, published in 1981. It took 15 years to research and write. Like Paul, he really liked President Kennedy, and he had a problem with the Warren Commission report because of the Zapruder film. It showed the president's head snapped back and to the left. And so he said the shot had to come from the front. And based on his knowledge of physics, the shot in the rear of the head couldn't have happened because it just breaks the laws of physics. What happened when they did the Warren Commission, everybody was said to be wrong. The explanation the Dallas doctors supposedly was wrong. They didn't know what they saw in the emergency room. They were wrong about the wounds. An entrance wound in the front and a fist-sized exit wound on the back, they didn't see that, according to the Warren Commission. Bethesda doctors who said the entrance wound was in the back and exit wound was the front, that's what they said. That's what the Warren Commission said. This was an unexplainable conundrum to David Lifton, and made him write this book. Also on this film that he did with Dennis, David, the funeral home employee, and Paul also had this funeral home employee who prepared the body. And this was done several months before the book was released. And all the people testify the same in the video about what the president's body looked like. It's in a different casket, body bag, and the other autopsy tech was not in it. Jim Jenkins, he wasn't in the film, but of course he says the same thing. They said the chain of custody of the body was lost. There was no paperwork. And all 3 of the people that were interviewed saw the same thing that of the president's head when he was taken out of this body bag. Jim Jenkins spoke at the Dallas conference in 2016, said the same thing. What brain tissue that was there could fit in the palm of your hand. Dr. Hume said the same thing. Now let me go further down here. Now, when Dr. Hume testified before the HSCA, he made this cryptic statement. This was for the Warren Commission. He made this cryptic statement for the Warren Commission. He was asked, where did the bullet come from? And he said there was no other explanation, that the bullet came from the rear, and that there is no other explanation for the exit other than from the rear. So you can see the contradiction there. It entered in the rear and exited in the rear. So he made this statement, cryptic statement. So he knew that he had to do a certain thing and he had to make things come out the same way every time. Is this getting to be too long, or can I keep going? I'm getting closer to the end.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So when I got this and got ready to do my presentation, which I did in 2016, I called Dr. Wecht and asked him about. I looked through the whole thing. I said, "What was it that brought you all to put this in this journal?" And I said, "All I can see is that there's an obvious difference between the two autopsies." And he said, "Yeah, that's it. That's the only reason we put it in this magazine." Or it's a journal, actually. And it still goes on, but it's under a different name. All right, now, so the first page of Robert's autopsy goes over the wounds themselves. Gunshot wound number 1, fatal gunshot wound, right mastoid region. Skin of the right mastoid region, and the course of the bullet. Skin of the right mastoid region, right mastoid petrous portion of the right temporal bone, which is here, right temporal lobe, and right hemisphere of the cerebellum. There was no exit. Direction was right to left, slightly to the front, and upward. Primary lesions, goes through that. Bone, dura, cerebrum. Secondary lesions, bone, meningeal lesions, cerebral lesions, later secondary lesions. Gunshot number 2, through and through, entry right axillary region, back in here. Soft tissue, right axilla, right infraclavicular region, clavicles right here. So it's slightly under this, and so it nicked the top of the brain, of the lung, gave him a collapsed lung. Right to left, back to front, and up. So the bullets were coming from back here. Gunshot wound 3, right axillary lesion, very close to the other one. Just below gunshot wound number 2, soft tissue, right axilla, soft tissue of the right upper back, and level of the 6th cervical vertebra. And that's the one that lodged up in here in the neck. 6 is about here. No exit. Okay, so here's the next page. So it goes through that, describes them. Then it goes through 59 pages of, exquisite detail. Here, I'm going to start. I'll thumb through some of these pages fairly quick. There's just page after page of this. This is a double-sided PDF. Let me flip to the last page here of Dr. Wecht's autopsy. So, first page of Dr. Wecht's autopsy is page 21, and this PDF has 34 pages. And it ends on page page 81 with all the signatures. So from page 21 to 81, but in between there's of course ads from various companies in the medical chain of money. Now we finally come to JFK's autopsy. Now it says nothing about the wounds on the first page. It has the date and hour, when it was performed, who helped him, procedures, cause of death, gunshot wound, head. Doesn't say where in the head. Clinical summary. It goes through available information from Dallas about Kennedy in an open car and somebody seen in the 6th floor window firing and shooting 3 shots. And there's a general description of the body, description of some wounds, the incisions, very brief description of various organs and so forth, and that's all there is. So it's very obvious what the problem with Humes' autopsy is. But again, I don't blame him, because he left some clues in addition to this cryptic statement. There were things that were left out. Now, JFK was known to have Addison's disease, which is an atrophy of the adrenal glands, and you have to be on a bunch of hormones. So he was on 3 different hormones that are produced by the adrenal glands, one of which is testosterone. Then there's the mineralocorticoids, and then the corticosteroids, which the body has, but there's artificial ones that you make that you can give people. And so the adrenal gland was not even mentioned. Where is it? They sit on top of the kidneys. The autopsy itself, where does he mention the kidneys here? Abdominal cavity, skeletal system. He doesn't even really mention the adrenal glands. I mean, the adrenal glands are atrophied when you have Addison's disease, but they're still there. And so that's something that you got to say. Yeah. The adrenal glands were atrophied, but he doesn't mention them at all. Oh, here it is. It's on the last page, actually. Kidneys sections show no significant abnormalities aside from dilatation and engorgement of blood vessels of all calibers. That's the description of the kidneys, nothing about the adrenal glands. JFK had surgery on his back from his wounds in World War II. The scars are mentioned in the skin, but he doesn't mention anything about the surgery itself, which was underneath. So it's sparse, and I think this was another one of the clues that he left, that it wasn't very much to it. He wrote it later. He did they went through the procedure. He used his notes, wrote up a handwritten autopsy. It was very short, brief, sparse. Then he went home and burned the notes in his fireplace, so they would never come out. But basically, that's it. Dr. Noguchi, when he did his autopsy, he went back to the crime scene once for certain, and it may have been twice, because what he was finding in RFK's autopsy didn't conform to what he was finding in the autopsy. In 2014, I did a workshop on the JFK assassination at the Veterans for Peace Conference in Asheville, North Carolina, that was based on this article, Paul's sworn testimony in the mock trial, and a book about Mary Pinchot Mayer, who actually my wife discovered this. She was looking for her brother up on the internet. His name is Jim Truitt, and it turned out there was a one of the main writers for the for the Washington Post, I think, Washington Post at the time, was also named Jim Truitt, and so she looked at that and read on that, and then she ran into this stuff about Mary Pinchot Mayer. Well, Mary Pinchot Mayer came from a pretty well-to-do family. They lived up in the Tri-Corner area of Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. And I forget the name of the town, but her family had a big estate there. She was very beautiful. And she married this guy named Cord Mayer, who was one of the upper people in the CIA. They did not get along well eventually because he was one of these, he was a CIA person, and she was probably the only wife in the whole circle of people who were involved with that. They always had, various had parties and get-togethers and gatherings where these people would bring their wives and so forth, and she just didn't fit in with that crowd. She eventually, she had known, I think, she knew President Kennedy when they were high school age. She was at a girls' boarding school nearby to Choate, where Kennedy went, and so they always had mixers and so forth. And that's when he first met her. In the time period, probably somewhere around the Bay of Pigs, they got together again. They started seeing each other, and she became his last affair. He had a lot of them supposedly, but she was the last one. But she changed him from, originally he was kind of a cold warrior when he came in, but a lot of it was playing a role that he thought he should play in order to get to be president and to be able to operate in the upper echelons of government. And she changed him to being somebody who got out of the Bay of Pigs peacefully, got out of the Cuban Missile Crisis peacefully. And when you read the book JFK and the Unspeakable by William Pepper, he goes through how Castro, Khrushchev, and Kennedy were communicating they were going to end the Cold War. And that's the reason why he was murdered. And there's others. But at any rate, he was going to end the Cold War. He was going to get troops out of Vietnam, but he couldn't do it until after the '64 election. That's what he told people very close to him. But of course he was never able to do it. And if you look at all the wars that we've been in since 1945, where did they take place?
Vietnam, Korea, Middle East.
Yeah. Now,
America.
That's a common location for all three of them, which is Eurasia. And so that's the eventual goal, is to control Eurasia, and that was said by a State Department employee explicitly. This is when I was, it was late August, early September this year. I think it was in late August. I was in Russia at the time, and on another trip. I went there in 2016, and I went again this fall. But the guy lays out explicitly, but there's two documents. One was for the State Department, one was for testimony, I think, to Congress, and they were differed in one sentence where he mentions this goal of the United States, which is to militarily control the Eurasian landmass. It goes back to the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which you both should know about. That came out after Gulf War I. It was a statement by Wolfowitz, and they could not tolerate any world power on the Eurasian landmass that could challenge the U.S. So that's the goal, to control the European landmass. They want to balkanize Russia into three or four different countries. It's never going to happen. So at any rate, pulling out of Vietnam was going to pull troops out of Vietnam. That's totally contrary to what this is. And so he was not going to, continue with this. So in that book, JFK and the Unspeakable, which is really absolute necessary reading to understand what happened to JFK, is that book. And he goes through these letters between Khrushchev, Castro, JFK. JFK had a back channel to Castro through their UN representative. And this came on after the Cuban Missile Crisis, because you wouldn't be here if the Cuban Missile Crisis hadn't worked out properly. You would not exist. Okay, I would be dead. She would be dead. It had been all over in the fall of 1962, when I was a freshman in college. So that book is, but then that takes up about half of the book or so. After that, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you really have to know to understand the JFK assassination. So JFK and the Unspeakable, the one, Dr. Ed Haslam's book, Dr. Mary's Monkey, which those two books pretty much seal it, and this autopsy article. They seal the whole thing. And then during this, as I said, during all this study of September 11th, JFK, another thing I ran into was the King assassination, and a barrister, he's actually an American, but barrister, he must have gone to law school in Britain, because lawyers are called barristers, I think, in Britain. So he goes by the barrister. After 20 years of research that began when he and Reverend Abernathy, who was Dr. King's main associate, interviewed James Earl Ray while he was in jail. It took 5 hours. He had been tricked into signing confession by a lawyer who then abandoned him to die in jail. After the interview, Ray and Reverend Abernathy were certain that he was not guilty. Now there's another book. Well, actually, Pepper eventually wrote 2 books. William Pepper is now Sirhan's defense attorney. He did a mock trial in 1999 of James Earl Ray. Ray was deceased at the time, but the key witness was an FBI whistleblower who spilled the beans on Hoover and the FBI and the 20th Special Forces Group from Alabama, who had set up the sniper's nest with a clear view of the courtyard of the Rain Motel where Dr. King and his entourage were staying. Interestingly, another one they were told to try and assassinate as well was Andrew Young, who was in the UN under, I think, Carter. And he was an African American from Georgia, I think Atlanta. It's well known in the civil rights movement. So what I came to the conclusion of in this workshop that I did was I knew from this that Sirhan and Oswald didn't do it. William Pepper proved that Ray didn't do it, and he was not a racist. There's another book by Paul, I can't think of his last name at the moment, but at any rate, there's another book that goes into more James Earl Ray's odyssey leading up to the time of the assassination, and how he was led around by his CIA handler named Raoul, who appears in the Malcolm X assassination. The movie Malcolm X came out in the 90s, and I had seen the movie, but I knew enough about the assassination that when Spike Lee came to UF and he spoke over at this O'Connell Center. And I asked him directly, were you aware that this guy that you showed in the film who comes up to Malcolm's little daughter, who was about 4 years old, and smiles and says, "Oh, you're so wonderful," and all this. Did you know he was one of the assassins? And he said, "Yeah." And he just went through it, said, yes, he was one of the assassination team. His name was Raoul, olive-skinned Latin. So we had these three patsies, none of whom were guilty. So that means whoever concocted these government conspiracy theories is the one who's guilty. So that's clear. As I said, Kennedy was going to pull the troops out of Vietnam. Martin Luther King totally opposed to Vietnam. You all know about his speech at the Riverside Church? Okay, you better write this down. Martin Luther King's speech at the Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967. So all you have to do is just search Martin Luther King speech at the Riverside Church. And it's called Beyond Vietnam. You can write that down. Beyond Vietnam is this speech. From that point on, Martin King became toxic. He was attacked by the media, by people in the civil rights movement, and it was about Vietnam, and he said the United States was the biggest supporter of terrorism and violence in the world. So the April 4th date should ring a bell, because April 4th, 1967, 5 days before I got my last unavoidable draft notice, he was assassinated on April 4th. And then when you read 1984, April 4th also comes up. It's Winston Smith's first entry in his diary is April 4th, 1984. So if you haven't reread 1984 and Brave New World since you were in high school, you better read it again, okay, and put it into context.
I wish they made us read those in high school.
So you never read it?
I have, but not in high school.
Oh, okay. People were talking about it when I was in high school, but we didn't
They
read
should
it.
make high schoolers read.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, let me see how much more I've got. I'm almost at the end of this. Bobby and Jack had met previously when Jack first came into Congress, when he was a representative from Massachusetts. They talked with a former diplomat to Vietnam about our involvement, which we took over for the French. We financed the French. It was $800 million back then. You know, $1 million was a lot of money. And we financed the French effort up until Dien Bien Phu, and then we took over. The elections in '54 were canceled. And the thing about Vietnam is that a lot of people don't understand is that everybody over there who was military also was CIA. And that's something that a lot of people don't know. And the Pentagon Papers really should have been called the CIA Papers, because people who were there were special forces, and then generals, and etc. Ranking officers and so forth. All those people were in the CIA also, and people didn't know it. I'm sure Ellsberg knew it, but the Pentagon Papers should have been called the CIA Papers, because it was about this history of Vietnam going back to probably the end of World War II. And it was, back then it was the OSS. We worked with the Viet Minh back then in Ho Chi Minh. William Donovan was over there. He said we should he should be our ally. This was back at near the end of the war, but at the end of the war, we put the Japanese soldiers back in charge. We gave them their arms, and they were supposed to hold down the Viet Minh, who William Donovan had been helping throughout the World War II and into China. And so everything flipped around. So Bobby and Jack had talked to this ambassador. He said, there's really no way we can prevent these two halves of the country, which was really artificial, from getting back together and forming one country. And so that was one of the reasons why he wanted to get out. Again, on the Bay of Pigs, Castro and all his intelligence people knew about what was coming, and that was one of the things that made the thing fall apart. Was a disastrous, type operation. It was doomed from the beginning because there were too many parts, and the CIA was running this giant covert operation, and when they're doing it, it's just not possible to hold things together, and so it fell apart. Now let me keep going here. Oh, okay. So I want to tell you about a man named Vincent Salandria. He was born in Philadelphia, and I'm going to read this. He was born in Philadelphia in 1926, graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Law School in 1951, became a lawyer. He was a pacifist. He had a long record of campaigning for civil rights. As a lawyer, he specialized in labor law and civil liberties issues. So I'm sure Paul knows a whole lot about him, because that's Paul's area of specialization is the labor movement. He was a member of the ACLU. He was one of the first people to criticize the Warren Report. In '64, he published an article in the Legal Intelligencer, which he argued that the wounds of President Kennedy suggested he had not been killed by a lone gunman. Over the next few years, Salandria argued that Kennedy had been assassinated by the national security state because he was trying to bring an end to the Cold War. And he is the only person back that far who understood what I just went through it with you about Eurasia. He's the only one who understood what the reason was. And he's the only person I've run across who has. He also rejected the idea that the assassination was organized by the FBI, the Mafia, the Soviet Union, Castro, LBJ, and so forth. He told a writer, Gaten Fonzi, who wrote another book about the assassination, I'm afraid we were misled. All the critics, myself included, were misled very early. I see that now. We spent too much time and effort microanalyzing the details of the assassination when all the time it was obvious. It was blatantly obvious that it was a conspiracy. Don't you think that the men who killed Kennedy had the means to do it in the most sophisticated and subtle way? They chose not to. Instead, they picked the shooting gallery that was the Daily Plaza, did it in the most barbarous and openly arrogant manner. The cover story was transparent and designed not to hold, to fall apart at the slightest scrutiny. The forces that killed Kennedy wanted the message clear. We are in control, and no one, not the president, nor Congress, nor any elected official, no one can do anything about it. It was a message to the people that their government was powerless. A book on the assassination of Kennedy, False Mystery, was published in 1999. In the foreword, Salandria argues, I wrote them some essays on the assassination, not to demonstrate any skills I had as a writer or as a scholar, since my writings clearly show my limitations as such. Rather, I wrote these pieces to explain how easy it was to come to the truth of how and why our national security state killed President Kennedy in order to perpetuate the Cold War. And there's one last thing I got to read. So he was not the only person to die for the same reason. the last three czars of Russia and two other U.S. presidents were assassinated for the same reason. McKinley and Lincoln. Lincoln and Alexander II were very close. There's a statue of them in Moscow, of them shaking hands, but they never met in person. They had a very close relationship. They were going to, the thought of the Trans-Siberian Railroad came into being around that time. Nicholas I, Alexander's father, was an engineer. He had the thoughts of this railroad, and that was going to happen. The next 16 years, from 1965, after Lincoln was assassinated, there were 8 attempts to kill Alexander II. They finally succeeded in 1981. McKinley was working with the Tsar at the time that he came on this Trans-Siberian Railroad, which Alexander III had brought into being. Alexander III was known as the Peace Tsar. He's known that by Russians, probably not by American historians. But he was the Peace Tsar. I ordered a course in 1700 to 1914, the Russian history course. And when we came to the part about Alexander III and the fact that he died of nephritis that was said to be due to drinking, my ears pricked up, and I said, because I knew enough about nephrology, that nephritis is not caused by alcohol. And so I have a paper that I wrote, and I can send that to you, about the fact that he was assassinated with arsenic. Then, of course, Nicholas II and his whole family were shot at the same time in a room. They killed all of them. They're now saints, or they were made saints shortly after that. So Lincoln and McKinley was going to, the Trans-Siberian was started. That was going to be expanded. It was going to run across the Bering Strait, down the west coast, all the way to the tip of Chile. It was going to, of course, it connected the east coast of Eurasia with Moscow, extended into Europe. It was going to go down through what is now Israel into Africa. They were going to have branches down there. There would be branches across the U.S. There's the Trans-Canada Railway, which goes across southern Canada. There were going to be railroads all over, going east-west in South America, Africa. This railroad was going to go everywhere, and it connected all the continents except Australia and North and South and Antarctica. They're the only 2 other continents, I guess. All 5 of the 7 continents were going to be connected by a railroad, and so the deep state did not want this. 2 survived attempted assassinations. Ford twice, who was carrying out Nixon's attempts to end the Cold War with Brezhnev. He had 2 attempts at him. They were the 2 women in Charles Manson's harem attempted to shoot Ford. They both missed. Reagan tried to get him. He was going to end the Cold War. I mean, it was 2 months after the inauguration. They shot him. FDR survived something called the business plot. It was an attempted palace coup, which failed because the retired general who they recruited to lead it, Marine General Smedley Butler, who wrote a book called War's a Racket. Write that down.
I've read it.
Okay.
Love it.
He blew the whistle. And so they just chose the wrong general. They were going to take the bonus army, which you ought to know about that. Paul knows about the bonus army. He was going to take, because all the veterans like idolized Smedley Butler. That's who they were going to use. Butler was supposed to lead it, but he blew the whistle. Another person was taken down by a palace coup, but you all don't know about it, but it was Nixon. Watergate was a palace coup. he was trying to end the Cold War, and presidents are not allowed to do that. And there's a book called Silent Coup. Write this down. To understand Watergate, you have to read Silent Coup. It's by Len Kolodny, Colodny. You can get it from Trine Day Press, write this down, Trine Day Press, that's where to get it. TRINEDAY Press. And I think their website is just trinedaypress.com. TRINEDAY. The guy who
The same publisher that did the Haslam's book.
right, and he does the JFK along with Judith. So Nixon was brought down with the Palace coup. It was John Dean and Alexander Haig were the ones who did it. The book is long. There's typos, especially in the beginning, which that you run into, but not many after that. But it goes through in minute detail what actually happened to Nixon. He didn't know what hit him. He had no idea what was going on. He had some idea. He knew about, things were being done, but John Dean was the one who set all that stuff up. And so you learn this Palace Coup. Kolodny's other book is The 40 Years' War, and that explains the rise of the neoconservatives from the Scoop Jackson Society, to the Project for the New American Century. The people who were behind the business plot were Wall Street bankers and lawyers. And the family name that connects all these plots, from the business plot to the JFK assassination to the John assassination and beyond. The family name that's connected to all of that is Bush. From Prescott to Poppy to W. And I can go through that at another time. But I think this is all I want to do. Let me just make sure. I don't think there's anything else. Okay, we're done.
All right. Well,
Wow, great.
Thank you. Yeah, for all your time. Yeah.
You're welcome.
That was quite
Thank
thorough.
you for
It
your
was lots
time.
of information.